every night, I would literally go to sleep pretty much thinking at some point, I'm going to be going to the funerals of my physicians and my nurses who are taking care of these patients because there's going to be, there's going to be broad infection, right? Like my colleagues are going to die. And I'd never in the military, like I'd never been in a command structure, operational command structure where I was having to make decisions around how do we keep people safe? And then how do we take care of these patients at the same time? Like how do we do both those things with limited supplies, limited information, all that stuff. And yeah, it was all encompassing. It's like everything we thought about all the time. And it was, I barely slept, maybe 4 hours a night. And again, deployments the military is really smart, right? When you go to a hot zone, right, you go for a certain amount of time and they pull you out. Even like SEAL teams and stuff like that, right? Or your frontline infantry folks, you don't spend much more than typically 3 or 4 months doing active combat, and then they pull you out, they pull you back into, you got to go to LUD, get some R&R.
You can't spend that much time switched on like that. It's too much.
But we didn't have that option, because the world went sideways, right? Everything got shut down. We didn't get shut down.
Welcome to this episode of the Post-Military Podcast. In this episode, Chris and I discuss his time as a doctor in the Air Force, his transition out of the military, and his work in the medical field outside of the military and during COVID. We also have a discussion on the emotional and mental battles veterans go through upon transitioning out of the military. As always, I hope that you gain a new perspective from this episode, and thank you so much for watching. Enjoy.
Solemnly swear.
Do solemnly swear.
That I will support and defend.
That I will support and defend.
The Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Post-Military Podcast. I'm your host, Billy, and today I'm joined by Chris Walker. Chris, thank you so much for being here today.
You're welcome. It's great to be here. Thank you.
Well, let's dive right into it. Chris, please tell everyone out there about who you were in the military.
Yeah, no, thanks for asking. I love talking about this experience because it's near and dear to my heart. As people get farther away, you recognize just how valuable all of it is. So reluctant military recruit. So I was one of those people, probably like a lot of folks, where I was facing limited choices and narrow paths in order to get to where I wanted to go. And for me, that was going to medical school. So I knew I wanted to be a doctor, but I found myself working after college in a Marriott hotel. Nothing wrong with that, but was not my aspirational career job. And wondering how I was going to go to medical school and pay for it. And literally had a book that I was thumbing through with medical schools in it to see where I would apply. And I found the Uniformed Services University in Bethesda. And decided, well, I read it and I said, wait a minute. Not only do you not pay to go to school there, they pay you. And so literally the extent of my decision was I called my girlfriend at the time, now my wife, and said, hey, there's a school in Maryland, but you have to join the military, but they pay for everything. And then you have to pay back 7 years after you're done with your training. And she's like, all right, sounds good. So that was it. And so I literally applied. Applying is expensive. And so I kind of limited resources to apply. And so it was that school and maybe a couple others. And I ended up.
What about the application process is expensive?
So you just applying itself when you apply to medical school, every school you apply to, you got to pay. I don't even know what it is now, but back then it was probably about $100 a school or something. Now it's more. Just to apply. It's like a processing fee. And then, as you can imagine, you got to fly out and interview places if you get an interview. And so, even back in the day, airfare was not cheap, plus a hotel and all that stuff. And so working I made $4.25 an hour working for Marriott plus tips. And so doing that, living in my grandma's spare bedroom, I had pretty limited capability to fund a bunch of those interviews. And so.
What year was this?
This was in 1994.
Because all of our listeners who are much younger are like, why can't you just FaceTime? Why couldn't you just do
Yeah,
your,
no,
that's crazy.
no,
Okay.
it wasn't a thing.
So you got accepted into,
I
okay.
got accepted. Yep. And you get your commission, actually getting accepted, which is really interesting. So you don't have to go to OTS or anything like that. As a physician, you get accepted, you get your commission. And, yeah, that was kind of, you have to get a physical, Dogmer physical is what a DOD medical evaluation board, right? Physical. So I had to go through all that. I'd had some orthopedic injuries and stuff. So I had to turn on my paperwork, and it got thrown back at me once, and they told me I was not coming. Literally, it was like 2 months to go, and they had the wrong person's paperwork. So
Well, that's good.
anyway, I ended up going to a VA hospital, or a Long Beach Naval Air Station the day it was closing. And I got a radiologist at Long Beach Naval Air Station, a Navy guy, to look at my x-rays, sign off on my paperwork for use, send it back, and I ended up getting it.
That's amazing. Okay.
Yeah, it's
So
great.
no, that's oh, I know a bunch of people who've had those really close calls with the DOD-MERB process. So
Yeah.
I'm glad that you were able to beat it. So after you go to U-Shoes, what was that experience like when you were going through medical school?
Yeah, it was great. I didn't know it at the time, but the military was a great fit for me. I liked this, I'd played sports growing up, and I liked the sense of community and the team basis. I was always a kid who was, a bit rambunctious, and so rules worked pretty well for me if you kind of give me boundaries and rules and all that stuff. So I actually appreciated the fact that, they told me what to wear, when to show up, what behavior standards were, all of that good stuff. And so I liked it. I liked being a active duty Air Force uh, second lieutenant in the military going. I enjoyed half my classmates were prior service. So, I went to school with people who were uh, pilots, who had then gone into medical school. My class president was a E7 in the Navy SEALs who had multiple combat deployments under his belt. So, and then there was a mix of them, all services together, and us, the newbies, the non prior service people together. So it was cool.
What was it like for you going through medical school? So you kind of said you just want to go to medical school, and the
Yeah.
military gave you an avenue to do that for free. And
Yeah.
when do you think that during your medical school process you kind of started gaining that appreciation for what the military culture was, or do you think that came post graduation?
Yeah, it's a great question. So Uniformed Services University is a Army command, though it's not just tri-service, it's quad service, because public health service is there too. And so our big class of 168 per year is made up, at least at the time, it was made up of Army, Navy, Air Force, and public health service, with the largest portion being Army. All of them reflect their service sizes. And, but having the Army command there, we did everything from not frequent, but like uniform inspections. And there was a lot of military history built into it. And so part of our class structure was military medical history. Like it's the first year, you're as a freshman, you're in there learning all about military medical history. And a large part of that really built I think you understood the traditions you were part of. And, we had dining ins and dining outs and all the traditions that go along with that. We wore our mess dress to those. We were in active duty. We were in uniform every day in class. And then we do field exercises Uniformed Services University was, developed by Congress in response to post Vietnam era of not having professional military physicians who that's just who they were and what they did. And so they had real understanding, operational experience. And so going there, a large part of what you're doing is learning and understanding the uniqueness of being a military physician alongside learning all the stuff you have to do to become a doctor. And so we did, training exercises and, the litter obstacle courses and then longer offsite ones that go to, we went to Quantico for a couple weeks, play with the Marines. It was super cool. San Antonio, Texas later. And then something that's unique that I think is interesting is in between your first and second year, if you're a non-prior service person, this is what it was when I was there. You had to do a summer experience with an active duty, with somewhere that was an active duty regiment doing something that related to your career field. So I, myself and a buddy, the first time I ended up at Travis out here, signed up with the 22nd, which was a C5 squadron, got a flight surgeon to sponsor us. And then we essentially lived with the active duty air crews of the 22nd for a whole summer, which meant at that time, flying around in flight suits and C5s all over the world, to all the different places and experiences, and getting pranks played on us the entire time, put chains in our luggage and zip tie it up and do mock crash scenarios inside the plane that were not real. And, but just to scare us and get us an oxygen mask. It was, it was really nice, high level hazing. I loved it. It was fun.
That's amazing. And so first question that I'm really interested in, what do you think is the most interesting part of military medicine history that you learned?
It's a great question. So the part I was let me give you a two-parter. So we all had to do a paper at the end of the first year on, with references from the era around military medicine. So I did mine on amputations in the Civil War, which sounds a little gruesome, but the reality is it's like they were doing very, very beginnings of, sort of cone ether anesthetic, field amputations and medical work out in the middle of,
Nowhere.
the deep South and above. And so I did my paper on that, which means I was reading references from the 1870s going forward. And I thought it was just really, really, really cool understanding how medicine progressed during that time, how much they learned about surgical technique and all the rest. The other piece that I thought was really interesting was one is the contribution to public health. The military really has been cutting edge around water safety, public health safety, outbreak prevention, all of that stuff. And then the other, I guess it's a 3-part answer. The final piece is that the entire field of salvaging people's legs who lose circulation to their legs, either through trauma or through blood vessels are clogged up, like when you have too much cholesterol, was brought about during the Vietnam era by these rock star military general surgeons who literally pioneered bypasses. So where they essentially take a good blood vessel and hook it up to the other end of a good blood vessel to bypass a part that's either been shot, blown up, or clogged. And I got to operate and I was more side by side, sort of watching and learning from these people who pioneered this, really famous names in medicine. And I thought that was super cool.
That's fascinating. I mean, shoot, we could have a whole podcast about military medical history, which is just something that you don't think about when you think about military history. So once you graduated from UShoes, so you finish your time at the school, then what happens next?
You go to residency. So I went to, you apply to residency programs, typically in the military, depending on your specialty. I applied to family medicine residency program because I was one of these guys. I really liked everything I did in medicine. I liked surgery. I liked delivering babies. I liked all of it. I like procedural stuff. And so I applied to family medicine. I wanted to get back I'm from California. And so I wanted to get back a little bit closer to family and frankly, sunshine. And so I applied a couple of places, but Travis Air Force Base was my number one. And they happen to have one of the better, and anybody watching this who went to other residencies is going to argue with me, but I think one of the better or the best training programs there for family medicine. Very full scope. You can do everything. You got trained in a lot of stuff. And so, so I went there, moved there with my family and spent 3 years training.
Okay. And what year was it when you finished your residency at Travis, which for anyone listening who is not in the military, that is north of San Francisco, right between Sacramento and San Francisco.
That's right.
So what
That's right.
year? Yeah, what year did you finish up your residency?
2001.
Okay,
Yeah.
and then, uh, wow. Okay, so what happened with your career in 2001?
Yeah. Yeah. So I moved with my family to Okinawa, Japan. That was my first duty station, as a family physician there. And, we got there that summer, and I was sitting in my living room doing, the tons of typhoons come through Okinawa, which are hurricanes in the Southern hemisphere, right? So tons of typhoons come through, and I was sitting in my living room doing typhoon watch for kind of our first one coming through, and the planes hit the towers. Uh, yeah, in September of that year. And,
And how did
yeah,
that affect your job going forward on Okinawa?
yeah, it was interesting because what I assumed is okay, it just got real. It's time to go do all this stuff we trained to do. What was interesting is, because of the footprint in Asia, um, and because of the fact it's purely military serving in Asia, there's no backfill of civilian medical providers. We ended up staying put in
Hmm.
Okinawa. Actually, most of the people I worked with, it did not become a site for medical deployments, at least as a small base that was in Asia. And so I ended up really doing pretty standard medical care there. The only piece where I sort of peripherally was supporting the effort is I did oversight for the independent duty medical technicians who serve the PJs. There's a PJ group in Okinawa, and then I don't know exactly what the Army's unit was, but it was an Army unit that people didn't talk a lot about. They had beards, stuff like that, that is out of Okinawa as well. So I did oversight for their independent duty medical technicians, and it helped with a lot of training environments for them to get ready for what they were going to do.
What was it like? What was it like working with those independent technicians? Which, for anyone listening who is unfamiliar with what a PJ is, it's a pararescueman
Yeah.
who their whole job is to go into combat zones and evacuate critically injured servicemen and women. It's a very noble career, and there's a really cool documentary on, I want to say, the History Channel or Discovery Channel, which, go check it out if that's something that sounds cool. But what was it like for you working with that kind of combat medicine?
Yeah, I loved it. I love tree. So I like to teach always. I realized that in my career. I like teaching medicine. So I was a chief resident when I was at Travis, which has a lot of teaching responsibilities. And so it was a natural fit for me doing training for the IDMTs. And they're rock stars, by the way. There's, you know, and again, I'm not going to shift gears to civilian world, but one of the biggest jumps for me coming out of the military was my enlisted team, whether it was my med techs in the clinic or certainly my IDMTs, were they were some of the best providers and professionals that I've ever worked with. They were just fantastic. And I was in my late 20s. It was super fun. I mean, I got to go on night ops, and these were all training missions that I went on, but night ops missions where we did combat landings in C-130s, dropped a crew of PJs off with an ATV in the middle of some island to go pick up a casualty, fake casualty. And then I was doing medical evaluation for them, and we're, in all the low light settings, and, landing the plane again, and they jump on. It was super fun. And then I got to, shoot some really cool guns with them at the range.
It's always a good time.
I loved it. Yeah, no, I loved it.
So
Sure.
what? So after you do your general medical practice in Okinawa, you're training these pararescuemen. What do you do next? What year do you wrap in Japan, and what do you go, what happens next?
Yeah, 3-year assignment. And I'd been recruited back to the residency program where I was this resident. They recruited me back to come be a staff member there, which means you're essentially a teaching physician. You're teaching residents and medical students at that point. And so they recruited me back there, and ended up back at Travis again, um, which is great. I never would have thought I grew up in Los Angeles. And so I never would have thought if you told me I was going to end up in Vacaville, California, and right now I'm staring out my window at fields, staring at fields. I would have told you were insane because I saw myself at like Laguna Beach or something. But yeah, ended up coming back to Vacaville. Thank God, because my smart wife, we kept our house that we bought when I was an intern. Landed there to come back and teach residents in the military.
That's really awesome that you were able to lean into. Was the teaching residency a choice, or was that something that just kind of happened for you?
You have to choose it. So those are assignments that are competitive assignments to go in and teach. And you essentially have to be recruited by the residency, apply, be recruited, interview, all of that stuff to go back and do it. You don't just drop in.
Okay. No, that makes sense. I mean,
Yeah.
I would hope that they had a pretty
Yeah.
selective process for the folks that are teaching teaching the residents.
Yeah.
What was that time like for you as an instructor for the residents?
Yeah, it was great. So I'll kind of put in the center of it. Travis was a rapidly deploying base. And so at Travis, we were all on deployment teams at Travis. And so during the time I was there, people were going on a very, very frequent basis every 4 to 6 months to, not individuals, but teams were rotating in and out every 4 to 6 months to either Iraq or Afghanistan. And so I was teaching there in the midst of all of that happening. Now, residents don't deploy, but it meant we were on a pretty lean teaching staff, with also kind of in the background, this whole thing going on where our compatriots were out there, doing their thing.
Would you send residents, or was the teaching staff getting tapped in addition to having to train residents?
Teaching staff is getting tapped. So for instance, we had like 10 faculty members. And at that point, the residency was, I think, 30 or 36 residents. And on pretty much routinely, we had 4 to 5 deployed somewhere.
Okay. That makes
somewhere
sense.
out there. And so everybody's short, right? Everybody's short stuff. So, but it was that setting of doing the teaching and whatnot. So it was tough, just from a workload standpoint and a responsibility standpoint, because you are responsible for everything the residents do too. But I don't actually have any bad memories of it. I found it was very rewarding. I believed very much in what we were doing.
I think this is something that people who aren't in the military or people who don't deploy regularly would be interested in. What does deployed medicine look like? And how does it change from what your day-to-day would look like at the hospital, stateside?
Yeah, it's a great question. It depends answer, because it depends on where you got stationed. And so there were a few regular rotations, but for most of us, big Air Force would just sort of stick us in the slots that needed to be filled for our what's called the AFSC, right? Which is our career field. So for family physicians, if you think about it, we were kind of like the Swiss Army knife, because we could do hospital medicine, we could do outpatient medicine, we could see kids, adults, whatever. And so we could go anywhere. And so I had colleagues that were, one of my good friends, I think you may interview him coming up, Dr. Jerry Klein, who ended up in Balad, Iraq during the worst part of the war. And he ended up being essentially an ICU and emergency room doctor, taking care of wounded, both combatant soldiers and our own soldiers and kids, and, with all the most awful stuff. And then there's everything from that to people who are working, say, on CCAT, which is a critical care air transport, which I think you're familiar with too, where you're taking the sickest of the sick, transporting them out of the war zone to higher echelon hospitals where they get care. I ended up kind of somewhere in between when I deployed. So I ended up at essentially a large air base where most of the air operations were going on. But it was not an active combat zone. And it was the way it was different was you were working with people you'd never worked with before. So imagine you show up with a crew, and some of the people may be from your base, but a lot of them aren't. You don't really know what the skill sets are. And then your equipment it just depends. And so because we were more of a rear hospital or rear echelon place within the Middle East, I worked the whole time at the place I was at. We actually had a CAT scanner, but we kept getting the parts sent up to Balad and Baghdad, understandably, to fix their CAT scanners so they could keep doing what they were doing in right at the edge of the war. And then you do a lot of stuff you wouldn't normally do. Like, I was an emergency room physician, even though I'm a family medicine physician. I took care of patients in the hospital in the ICU, and you can do that as a family doc, but it's not your typical normal. One of my colleagues was an oncologist, a cancer doctor. He was an emergency room physician. So you're doing a lot of that stuff. I rode in the back of ambulances to take our people down to Doha, to some of the big centers there where, they could do truly emergency stuff that we could do at the base. It's just very different. You have to be very, very flexible, and not super risk averse.
Yeah, I would imagine not, because you're really getting put in a lot of high stakes situations where you kind of have to, the consequences for not making something work is very high in your profession. And so I would imagine that being highly flexible is important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's mostly that I was lucky though. I mean, I consider myself very fortunate. I was at a base where we were not in active danger. The hardest part for my deployment, frankly, was just the officer 24/7. I was the chief of staff there. And so it was, both being clinically active and then working as the chief of staff for the group commander there, and then being away from my family.
Yeah. Being away from your family is a thing that I think everyone in the military who's ever deployed can certainly empathize with. So once you're done in your time teaching residents, you've gone overseas a couple of times. When did that not tour, when did that specific assignment end? And what happens next?
Yeah. So my active duty commitment to uniformed services ended, and it's a 7-year commitment after residency training. So '08 was when my commitment was up. And when I got back from my deployment, it was really apparent to my wife and I, and our kids. I had my girls at that point were, hold on, let me think through this, like 7 years old and 3 years old. And the deployment, it was almost because I was in that chief of staff role, it was almost 6 months. And it was hard for them. It was really rough for them. And the operational tempo at that point was not slowing down. It was, in fact, it was accelerating to some extent. And so the promise was that you would go, on average every 12 months. And some of the billets were becoming Army billets and things like that were sometimes 12 or even 18-month deployments. And so I did the math around, how much time away from my family I was probably guaranteed to spend. It was going to be about 2 to 3 years if I'd stayed on for my full 20. I had to do some soul searching, to be really honest, about how fully committed I was to that mission, that particular mission. To be frank, if it was what we were doing in World War II, and, I don't think I even would have thought twice. But at that point I was, I think a lot of us get a little jaded at the end of our career, but I was just questioning, like, gosh, is this worth it still to keep doing it? And so I made the hard decision about, looking for jobs outside and separate.
How many years? So would that be, how many years were you in at that point?
14.
Wow. Okay. So
Yeah.
that's fascinating. I mean, like, you don't really hear about a lot of people who make it that far and then go, well, you know what? This is it for me. Which, however, I think that's a very mature decision to say, what's more important, this pension or so I think that's, I want to dive into kind of that identity piece here in a bit. But so when you knew that you wanted to leave
Yeah.
What did you start doing to prepare?
Yeah. So, it's funny. Initially, there was a civilian job right there where I worked, doing the same job I was doing as a civilian. And so my initial was like, well, that's easy. I'll just, change clothes and get this, I don't know what GS level it was, some high GS level job to work there and do the same thing. And it was my wife is really wise, right? She's like, I know that's comfortable for you, but you really ought to look out there and see what else is out there before you decide on, committing to the same place. Cause, there are a lot of, that's all the same stuff with everybody deploying. The workload was so very, very high. Um, and you lose all the military benefits, when you go over to GS. So she was smart. And so I ended up broadening my search. And this was probably about a year before, maybe 10 months before I actually had my separation date. I broadened my search to the local hospital systems and stuff that were in our area here and started applying and interviewing.
Do you think that if your wife wouldn't have said anything, do you think you would have pretty easily just stepped into that GS role?
Yeah, probably. Probably. I mean, again, it wouldn't have been a change for like the system I was used to doing. The sort of the thing that was driving me was I didn't want to, leave. I grew up without a lot of father presence, in my life. So one of the things I was committed to having kids was that my kids would have a dad around, present, engaged in their life. And so that was the driving force. And so the thought was, yeah, if I could have the same job, I love that. And I just, stay, I probably would have done that.
Okay. I mean, that makes sense. And I think that so you think you would have picked that job because it was familiar and therefore the safe option. Yeah. I
Yep.
mean, I think that for a lot of people, that is why they end up in those positions. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but
Mhm.
it also forces people into paths that they might not enjoy down the line because
Yeah.
sometimes similar is not necessarily a good thing.
Yeah.
Um,
No, it would
so
have been hugely career limiting for me too. I just didn't know it at the time.
yeah, no, and it's cool to be able to look back on that and
Yeah.
assess what in your career search, do you have any advice that you would give to people who are transitioning out of the military? And obviously, you're in a very specific case where a lot like me, I did cyber, so it was very easy to go, well, there's cyber on the outside, and
Yeah.
even more so for you, you were a
Yeah.
doctor, so you're not going to go not be a doctor on the
Right.
outside. But beyond that, what advice might you have to people transitioning out in general?
Yeah. No, it's a good question because I think there are core qualities and core pieces of our experience and culture as veterans, which, which are highly valuable. And I don't know that people completely recognize them when they're getting out because you live in it. And when you're living in it, sometimes it even drives you crazy, but you don't find it's as valuable. But I think one of the pieces was understanding the value of the values of military culture, the ethics, kind of the moral compass, the service before self. Those are actually, and I even think maybe today more rare than they were before. And I think understanding that part of that package was um, really valuable to employers as well.
Mhm.
Like I just took for granted that everybody was like us outside. And I know not everybody in the military, it's like there's lots of characters in the military, right? Lots of people who don't do the right thing. But in general, there's a selection bias for people who are service oriented, mission oriented, all that stuff. And that is not the norm in the civilian sector necessarily.
Yeah, I definitely want to dive into. I want to dive into that. What we're kind of gonna blend a couple of the themes that I want to talk about, but um, for you, what has been the would you say that that was the biggest piece of culture shock for you getting out of the military, in terms of, like, just that mindset swap from, like, this, like, high speed, like, I'm in the back of a plane, dropping off people, low vis night ops, like that side of medicine, or taking people to ambulances, taking people to Doha in ambulances, or
Yeah.
I'm family practice, but now I'm in ER, like I'm in an operating room, stuff like that. Um, do you think that that was the biggest, like, what was that culture shock for you like, where you go to whatever you did next in the post-military?
Yeah, well, it's interesting, right? So I ended up picking a big organization that offered me a lot of the same benefits, pension, all of that stuff like the military did, the kind of all-in-one piece. There was a lot of parts about the organization I ended up working for, which were similar to the military. So I thought like, okay, yeah, that'll be, even their mission basis it's different than traditional fee for service like medicine. So I'm like, okay, this will all align for me. And then, yeah, you're right. I showed up and suddenly I was like, I'd gone from being a lieutenant colonel select program director, uh, uh, prior chief of staff to being just, a frontline, newest guy on the block doctor. The memory that is most distinct is, I showed up the first day and actually, I would say that I think the culture here is a lot better than it was now than it was then, but I showed up. No one really was there to say, hey, you're showing up. There was no in processing. And then literally like people like, oh yeah, you're the doctor here, you're over here. And I literally got led to a supply closet that had been changed into an office, windowless supply closet changed into an office, with one of those like 1950s era desks, like the metal ones, the metal ones, like they're real loud when you slide them
Yep.
over in.
Yep.
There's always some dusty ballpoint pens in there and stuff. So there was that.
It's got like the faux wood
Yeah,
top.
full wood
Yeah.
on top, all the
Yep.
rest is metal, like
Yep.
probably weighs 600 pounds.
Mhm.
So in an office like that, and there's another doc in there in the corner, and I'm like, oh, hey, how's it going? I'm Chris Walker. Nice to meet you. And he just sort of turns around. I was like, yeah, and I was like, whoa, so I'm in and I was like, whoa. And then they took me to lunch the first day, kind of the tradition, like new guy, take him to lunch. And so I went to lunch with the some of the leaders from the clinic, and they're like, yeah, man, this is the last time you'll be eating lunch because you're gonna be working through lunch, and like, good luck getting home before 7 o'clock at night. Like the stuff they don't tell you in the interview. And I'm like, what? I'm like, what? Because the military, we think there's a lot of things we think are horrible, but frankly, unless we're deployed, our hours are pretty good in general. We do come, like we show up weekend night whenever, duty calls, but the normal ops is pretty good, right? Like, we have an early show time, but our go home time is good. And I literally went home to my wife that night and I said, I made a mistake. I need to go back to the base because the reserve was ready to sign me up like today, $50,000 pay, come back. We'll pay you 50 grand, family physician. You will deploy, but welcome back. And I told my wife, I made a mistake. I'm going back. This is horrible. There's no way. And nobody was talking to me. Like people weren't saying, hey, like the whole culture of like how you get welcomed into a new unit was just non-existent.
So I want to go back to that, but one of my interesting questions I always ask people is, so you were a lieutenant colonel select, you'd been a
Yeah.
chief of staff, which
Yep.
for people who are unaware, you're essentially you're the executive. I don't want to say assistant because that underplays what you are. You basically manage a lot of things for a very important individual.
Yep.
You had taught residents, you had done all of this
Yep.
command level stuff.
Yeah.
How did you handle going from an organization where you were essentially incredibly proven and not walk on water, but people took you very seriously,
Sure.
to
Yeah.
you're in a broom closet with a guy
Yeah.
and they're just kind of like, you're whatever. What
You
was
just know to
that?
knock. You're just like, here you are. Yeah.
Yeah.
Welcome. You're the new
Yeah.
guy. Yeah. And historically, most of the people who were there had been there 5, 10, 15 years. Like I really was the new guy, right? Like they didn't know me from Adam for the most part. Well, it's funny. I thought like I got out thinking I want to do whatever I want to do, get as far away from what I was doing as possible. I mean, I just want to take care of patients, which I've always loved. do my work, get home to see my kids at lunch, get home to, get on home at time on time. I want to still teach if I could. So I'd managed to sort of negotiate some of that. And I managed to negotiate working in the hospital too, which kind of fed that part of me of like the, back of the airplane emergencies. People are sick in the hospital. So you got codes and all that stuff. So I thought that's what I want to do. I think I underestimated the level of pridefulness that I had around, thinking I should have been treated better than I was treated, so it was a good humility check for me.
I mean, I think there's two sides to every story. Like, and if you want to empathize with the individuals in an organization that hires you post military, they have been there longer. There are things that are nuanced that do not exist in the military. And
Yeah.
so there is a very fair is very fair for people to look at you as someone who does not know anything in that organization.
Yep.
However, the flip side of that is you do have this body of experience that is highly unique and very broad comparatively to a lot of other people in your career field. And so I think that most people in the military struggle with this to some degree because, on one hand, you are completely justified to kind of
Yep.
feel like I am this, I am all that kind of. But on the other hand, there are things that we don't know. And so, how did you kind of deal with that pride um, and get yourself to a place where you were able to humble yourself to kind of accept that you're in this new chapter and there are things that you don't know, and that's okay.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's interesting. I think a lot of the things we take for granted, right? Like when I moved to Okinawa, when I would say any new bay, I had a sponsor, and that person picked me up, my family up in their car at the airport when we arrived, and like made sure we were hooked up and connected, and and they stayed. Like there's all of these things like culturally that I was that just weren't there, and even like I didn't recognize how much I identified with my rank, like how like yeah, being a field grade officer is something I was really proud of. And it's cool. It's cool, like a good feeling as you promote and that you've accomplished that. And so I'm not sure I fully recognize the fact that when all that got pulled away, that both the customs and the identity piece with rank, how disruptive that would feel to me at the time. I didn't even know it was going to happen to me. Like I mean, I didn't know my brain was going to react that way. I thought, oh, it'd be fine. I'll show up. I'll have my tie on and my suit, and I'll show up, and it'll be this thing. Now, commentary. As I've been with the organization for 15 years, a big part of what I ended up doing as I moved into leadership was we create a very customized welcome for people. Sponsor. We actually decorate their office we find out from their family what they're into. So if they're Star Wars people, we decorate their office with that stuff. And we get a picture of like their family or their dog. We'll put it on their desk. Find out what snacks they like. So when you show up now to your office, in general, it's different. It's much more of that custom. But I learned that from the DoD. I know that wasn't the question you asked.
I think it's an excellent lesson, which is there are ways to take what you experienced in the military and then translate that into things in your next chapter or many chapters down the line where you can provide benefit for people.
Yeah.
However, there are also reasons why in that first chapter of your life, once you've transitioned out of the military, you don't want to think that you are all that because you are in a new situation and there are nuances that you do not understand. And so I think approaching that new, and this is something that I've struggled with, is approaching these new situations with humility and allowing my military experience to inform my decisions, but I don't need people to recognize my military accomplishment for me to make a more nuanced decision based off my prior experiences. So I think that what you're saying is incredibly valuable and definite. And I mean, now you've been you said you've been with this hospital system for 15 years.
That's right.
I'm
That's right.
sure you could look back and say, "Oh, I didn't know this or this or this
Yeah.
or this like about this hospital system." And
Oh yeah.
it was
I was
dumb for me to think that I did at the time.
Yeah, it was it's funny. It was more I didn't have any expectation that I would have all the knowledge I knew I could doctor. Doctoring I knew I could do, right? But even that, like patients are way sicker outside of the DoD than in the DoD. We have a selection bias in the DoD, like healthy people, healthy families. Yeah, there are some people that have some illnesses, but like if you're taking care of active duty troops and their families and even veterans, they're healthy. They're healthy because you're not taking care of VA. So coming out, I was like, oh my goodness, everybody has diabetes. I'm like, wow. And so there was a ton of humility of going like, I thought I was a really hotshot doctor. And I think I was really just at the sort of beginning of my medical learning curve. And honestly, like, I don't think I didn't spend very much time sitting in the fact that I didn't feel recognized, valued, or whatever for my prior experience. I just pivoted very quickly into like kind of doing what I do, which was, take care of people as patients. And then I think the other secret weapon military members have that you don't know you have is your willingness to work really hard and serve others above yourself, including your colleagues. It's really not normal for the most part. And I always tell people in this organization, I never, ever wanted to be a leader. In fact, even in the military, I never wanted to be a leader. I didn't want to be an admin guy ever, ever. Like chief of staff in the Middle East was because they assigned me that because I was the major. And at the residency, I was an associate program director because teaching faculty, but I avoided the committees, I avoided command assignment, all that stuff. But the reason I ended up in leadership here was because of that military service ethos. Serving others, service for ourselves, sharing, coming alongside people. It's different. And it actually makes us really, really good. We're willing to work on a team with people from different places all of that, work with our medical assistants, having worked with my enlisted people so fluidly. A lot of doctors are a bit hierarchical in how they will treat staff, nurses. Your wife's a nurse. She can tell you that, Billy, right? Like, and the military teaches you some really good lessons. Like if you end up behaving that way, you don't have a good team to work on. The team will not work with you regardless of rank. And, that ended up being my secret weapon that I didn't even know I had that I think most vets have. I love working with veterans now. We have special badges here now, actually, where we have a little nameplate on the bottom that says if you're a service veteran from somewhere. But I could tell you without looking at that when someone's had active duty service because of how they serve.
That's really awesome. And what do you think? So you've highlighted some really awesome things that people bring out from their time in the military.
Yeah.
When you were leaving the military, were there any things, and this will feed into our conversation about identity, were there any things that you realized as you were transitioning out or later on that you needed to kind of leave behind?
That's it's a really good question. Things I needed to leave behind.
I'll give you an example to
Yeah.
just kind of jog your memory, to kind of give you kind of where I'm going. So for me, I really viewed the military. So I viewed the military as a lifestyle.
Yeah.
But I viewed the military as my job.
Yeah.
And that wasn't true now that I look back on it, because I was a cyber warfare instructor. So that was
Yep.
my job. But I
Yep.
also ran the squadron bar. I also was in charge of fitness tests for the unit. And then I had all these other things. And so it kind of permeated into various aspects of my life that when I moved into my first job outside of the military, for some reason I expected my job to be this multifaceted thing.
Yeah.
And I realized that I need to leave behind that mindset of job is lifestyle. And
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
I need to just look at job as job. And then everything else can a lot of things can coexist, and they all don't have to have this narrative through line of the exact same organization has them. And
Yeah.
so I had to leave that behind in my last chapter. So is there anything like that that it took me a year to recognize that. So it might
Yeah.
not have happened immediately, but is there anything like that for you?
Yeah, it's interesting. You say that. So I was the fitness instructor for our flight, and so I ended up getting the military DoD paid for me to get certified as a spin instructor, and so I would take the flight over, and then some other squadron folks would come over to the gym at Travis on Friday mornings and teach a spin class there. On Friday mornings from whatever it was, 7:30 to 8:30 or something like that. And it was great. I loved the activity and the fitness piece of the military. And so when I got out, that I really liked that. That went away for me. But I ended up taking a job at Gold's Gym on Monday and Wednesday mornings from at 5 a.m. teaching a spin class from 5 a.m. to 6 a.m. And I taught that for 10 years while I was a doctor here. So every Monday and Wednesday, I'd show up at Gold's and teach a spin class for Gold's from 5 to 6 a.m. And then, come home, get ready, and come do my doctor job. So I guess I didn't really let that go. And thinking about that, that was a piece of it. I think I think part of what I had to let go was there's a sense of accountability in the military that exists, and there are very real structures in place. I think in good commands, there's all kinds of commands, but around holding individuals accountable both for their behavior and their performance. We have the EPR and the OPR system, and your ability to progress and all that stuff, depends on your performance in general. And coming outside, I had a really hard time with the fact that didn't exist as much in the outside, that they're, you can hide in mediocrity. And again, I know the DoD, you can do this too. Right. But it was a little bit easier to have that happen. And I had a harder time letting that go, but also flexing into learning how to lead by influence and develop people better, and so, cause I think we kick into that sort of like carrot and stick in the military pretty quickly. Bob's not showing up for work on time. Yeah, come to the commander's office. Here's what's going to happen with that. And, we could put you in prison at some point. Right. When I showed up to work and the first time I, heard somebody was having an affair at work, and I was like, oh my God, in my head, I'm like, are they going to prison? Because it clearly is disruptive outside of the military too. Understanding oh no, we don't police morality in that regard. We don't do that. It's just a matter of figuring out how it disrupts the work. That was very hard for me to extinguish my brain.
I mean, first, fair. And I mean, you just had come from an organization where if you had an affair, that is it for you. Cause again, in the military, it's not just a job, it's an organization and a lifestyle. So we almost have to police lifestyle ethics in addition to job ethics, which is a really, like in any other civilian career, that's not necessarily the case, which is,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, cause you're asked to, in the line side, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's cause you're asked to make decisions about who goes and gets in the way of bullets
Yeah.
and bombs,
Mhm.
and that sort of decision cannot be clouded by this other stuff. So I'm not sure I understood that as deeply, as I did getting out. And, it was harder for me to let that go, that part.
Yeah, but it's cool that you're able to recognize it because I think that for a lot of veterans who haven't built up this intrinsic ability, you just get bothered by
Yeah.
things
Yeah.
and you just live your life annoyed without ever actually identifying or being able to vocalize things like, I appreciated that there was a morality, or that there was an enforcement of morality outside of just the like outside of things affecting work.
Yeah.
Or I appreciated that there was almost this filtering aspect, so everyone kind of shows up to work ready to rock. And um it's cool that you are able to verbalize that, because I think that that's something that's more rare than we think it is. So, um, I want to go back. Something that I am really interested in that vein of being able to intrinsically view yourself. How did you get to the point where you're able to vocalize? Like, I think that there's really three layers, and pretty sure I said this on a podcast before, but you don't understand anything that's going on inside of you. Then you have a vague sense of what's going on inside of you, but you can't tell somebody else. Like, you kind of know what you're feeling, but if I asked what's wrong, you couldn't tell me. And
Yeah.
then there's the highest level, which is, I know what I'm feeling, and I'm going to tell you what I'm feeling. How do you think you built up that ability? Because I think it is very important for veterans to develop that skill, because they're going to hit these peaks and valleys of emotion as
Yeah.
they're transitioning out of the service.
Yeah. It's a good question. Yeah. And it's funny. I don't think I realized the impact, the tough impact, the negative impact that some of what happened in the service, had with me. And again, I'm very open to the fact I was not in an unsafe place, or anything like that. But there is the piece of, sort of being picked up, deployed somewhere away from the family. And then, there's just taking care of the people that were coming in, from Balad, Iraq, the people who weren't bad enough to go back home on the airplane, but were we going to rehab them? And then even just seeing some of the mental health aspect of war was, really significant. So, everything from, if someone tried to jump off their ship into the Navy in the Gulf to try to take their life, we would take care of them until they could get out. And then we had members of our own team. The first night I was in the desert, one of the nurses who was going back home, because I was the chief of staff, I had overlap with the old crew. So I came in before everybody, all the new crew came in, and I heard screaming in the room next to me. And I came out, and she had attempted suicide, cut both of her wrists all the way through, because she was facing going back home to a domestic situation that had fallen apart, and she was about ready to go back home. And so I didn't deal with any of that. Because if you're, I don't know what it was like when you were coming back from deployment, but when we were coming back, you had to fill out this checklist that essentially, said, are you having mental health stuff? Are you anxious? Are you losing sleep? Are you having bad memories? Blah, blah, all the PTSD stuff. And everybody, at least on my team, we all checked it no, because if you checked it yes,
You have to stay longer.
you stay longer.
Yeah.
Your ticket gets popped and you have to go talk to the psychiatrist. I was like, not doing that. So I stuffed it, I used to call it pridefully, put it in the box. I just put it in the box, and I'm sorry for that graphic story, but that
No,
one's in my box, right?
Yeah,
It's
no,
in there.
I totally
Um,
get it.
Yeah. And we do that a lot as doctors too. We just see a lot of really hard stuff, like a lot of really hard stuff.
Mhm.
We do it, but I don't know that I understood the part of the veteran piece, and that piece, and the wartime piece. And, there were suicides in my group, like, I don't know that all of that I'd sort of dealt with, when I came out. And it was interesting. There was a part of being a part of that team in the military that was therapeutic, and you lose that when you come out. So, and I think this is why people join like the VFW or, different like associations, so they can go and have some beer and talk about this stuff when they're,
Because
become
people can
civilians.
validate your experience.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I did, that part of me, I didn't realize it until later, but it was a bit difficult. I found it was very hard to connect with my colleagues who didn't have that shared experience, with me. I definitely felt like kind of a fish out of water in that way. I didn't act like it. I mean, people wouldn't have known, very socially, like I like
Yeah.
people and all that, but it definitely felt that way.
how did you start working through your box
Yeah.
essentially and build up the mental tools and the fortitude to actually kind of unpack those very serious things that you've experienced, and also get to a point of self-understanding where you're able to talk about it.
Well, no, I'll just tell you the truth. I did.
Okay.
What I did is I took on more tasks and I took on more responsibility and I pushed and I pushed and I pushed and I pushed. And frankly, it was fine. I think probably just like a career, career military person, right? What I didn't know is I'm definitely addicted to the adrenaline. I like challenges. I like when things actually go awry a little bit because I like jumping in and getting it done with that. And so I just continued to create as I became more expert in the doctoring piece here and the system. I just kept kind of looking for that space to recreate my chaos so that I could feel normal with it. And then the sense of people depending on me, like the military team, I kind of recreated that and saying yes to more leadership stuff. Um, and honestly, I don't know that I really dealt with it until the pandemic, where I hit my mental health wall with all kinds of drama and glory finally, and that's what actually forced me to begin um, actually recognizing there was a box and that and not dealing with it. I actually been, I think creating a lot of my own duress and, having an impact on my family longer term too. I mean, I wasn't like unsafe at home or anything like that. I wasn't, and, no judgment to anybody who's had stuff with that, but, I just was a workaholic. And, so being home for my kids, I was deployed here essentially
No,
by
I
choice.
I think that I mean, I think that's a common experience though, because again, we view the military as a lifestyle, but I think while we're in it, we view it as our job. And
Yeah.
so then it's so easy in the next step of your life to try and find the same validation through your work. And we don't think I can find this validation through means other than my job, because most jobs will rarely, if ever, provide the same, like, don't use a drug analogy, but the same hit like
Yeah.
that whatever you did in the military would provide. So I think that you doing that is a very it's very common. Um
Yeah. We
and
go
so
in, right? We
yeah.
often, like, you're not sane when you choose, like, I could have gotten like some other sort of scholarship probably, or gone to work. I don't know, something different, but I like with almost no thought go, yeah, I'll join the military and sell them 14 years of my life for
Yeah.
medical education, like whatever,
Yeah. It
and I
is what it
loved
is.
it. I was like, oh, this is perfect. And I think it kind of finds us in that way. And,
Yeah.
and it's good. I mean, it's really good. There are people like that who will go and do it. Um,
No, I think that you need people like that. The country needs people to do that
yeah.
because it's what keeps us safe. It's what
Yep.
um lets everyone else in America sleep safely at night. And there isn't anything wrong with that. It's just, how do you then safely decouple yourself
Yep.
when the show ends, when it inevitably does? And
Yeah.
that's the $1 million question for people um leaving the military. And
Yeah.
so that's it's great, but it also has to come to an end, and that comes with some detachment process.
Yeah.
And that's rough. It's a rough thing that's hard to define because it's very specific to everybody. And
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's easy. I think I could have gone a number of directions,
Mhm.
right? In that regard, right? And I dove into workaholism, but
Yeah.
I certainly could have picked another aholism, and exercise too. Like again, I told you I love the fitness piece, and so I
Spin
started,
Doctor Walker.
yeah, double centuries, right? I did double centuries on my bicycle, which
Oh
is a
my
200-mile ride, right, all in a row, or marathons, all kinds of different stuff to kind of feed
yeah.
that piece. And then I think the bridge came honestly, like one was coming to the end of myself, was kind of getting to that point where, I took on so much that it became too much. And again, the pandemic was my kind of crucible moment. Um, but also recognizing the real need in my life for a good community, healthy
Yeah.
community,
Hmm.
people, and people find that lots of ways, right? Some people find it through veterans groups. Some people get lucky enough to find a crew at work that is that group.
Hmm.
That can happen. And, for me, it was through church and my faith community where I started to build some of those like brotherhood and sisterhood relationships that I think we only find through, forged through battle, just to be a little, bit cliched.
I don't think you have to. I don't think it's cliched when you're talking about being a medical provider during COVID at all. So
It
I
was the
think you're.
same. It was,
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
telling
I think
and
it's a
it was
very.
literally a 3-year deployment.
I think you are. If there's anyone in the world who is allowed to say that, it's people who worked in the medical professional for the
Yeah.
past 3 years of their life.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Yeah. And
um,
I will tell you something, being a veteran was the most valuable piece of experience that I could have ever had
I'm sure.
walking into it.
Yeah. No, it's. I wanna dive into kind of COVID, this breaking point, and then this development for you in a second. But
Sure.
there's something that I'm really curious about. So you said earlier in the podcast that you went to your wife and said, "Hey, I need to go back. Like the reserves are
Oh,
calling. Like I
yeah.
can't
Yeah.
do
Yeah.
this." And you're talking about like, "Hey, I dove into work because this was something that I was missing, and I dove into fitness because this was why didn't you go back? Like it's almost and like what stopped you?"
She's really good about, like a lot of us when I
Mhm.
definitely married up and well, and she's really, is where I'm sort of impulsive and like just go do it, jump in, like jump off the cliff and check the water later.
Mhm.
She's a lot better about, well, hold on, let's think through this. Have you thought about this, and this? Let's consider this. And then she's gotten really good. I don't know if she did this then, but she's gotten really good at saying, listen, your decision is ultimately that that's what you want to do. I'll support you, but I want you to think through this stuff and get up a little bit more time. And she said something like that, at that time. And I knew she was right. I knew I didn't want to, I didn't want to go back to Iraq or Afghanistan,
Do you have any advice for because I'm sure everybody when they're transitioning out has that and this isn't just going
Yeah.
military to civilian, this is just major chapter of your life, A,
Yeah.
major chapter of your life, B, everyone's gonna have that moment where they're like, "I made a terrible mistake."
Yeah.
Do you have any advice for people that, like, how do they ride that wave and kind of move through that?
That's good. It's a good question. So, if old me could go back and talk to young me, I would have said, do really good due diligence and do your homework in advance of making it be a really big life decision around, career choice, all of that stuff. But I would also tell them that, nothing ever ends up exactly the way you think it's going to be at the beginning. And, to have some flexibility around that and realize, and again, I have a faith basis, right? So there's my favorite verse, God, Romans 8:28, God uses all things for the good of those who love him, right? And like I really do believe, I'm not sure I fully believe that then, but I really do believe like, you know, regardless of your choice, the path is going to end up being okay.
Mhm.
And there are always going to be some options.
Yeah, and I think that the other piece that I'll add on to that, which you said, is you didn't want to deploy again, and so you had good priorities for leaving,
Yep.
and in that moment of questioning, you were able to lean on your community, so your wife,
Yep.
and then also the priorities that were the catalyst for you leaving in the first place to say, I don't really like this now. However, I made this decision for a reason that has not changed. So I'm going to ride this out. And that
Yeah.
is, I think for people making that transition, that's why understanding your priorities are so important for why you're making that transition, because it allows you to ride the wave when inevitably you hit some level of adversity and you go, this sucks. And I need to, I need to go back to the last thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I mean, understanding there is no truly green grass, not like well, all grass has green and then all grass has like patches, right? Or, you can use whatever analogy you want for stuff. You can step into the grass, right? All of it has that, and so I do think probably the biggest mistake you can make is sort of painting that future version of what you're going to do as the escape from everything you don't like about the present version.
I
Um,
completely agree. Yeah,
yeah.
I think that there's a lot of people who I talk to who go like, "I hate the military so much and I cannot wait to leave." And I'm like, "Well, you don't hate all of it." And they're like, "No, I hate all of it." I'm like, "Okay." And that's
Yeah.
like, you think you do, but I've never met someone that's really true. And the funny part is even if it was true, when you leave, then you have nothing to hate. So you're gonna still feel loss somehow. And which would be an unfortunate way to move into this next chapter of your life for
Yep.
sure.
I've been able to talk to residents before. I got asked for, I think they got like to the fourth person on the list for graduation speakers for Travis. And so one of my old colleagues asked if I would come be the graduation speaker for the residents graduating from the programs there. And so I did it on a heartbeat. I love anytime I get to go on base, I'm super happy about it. Which is odd, just so you know, like that for me, like the commissary, I get all like sort of like warm and fuzzy when I go in, and the PX, it's bizarre. Um, but I went back and gave a talk, and one of the things that I've had a couple opportunities to talk to residents and people on active duty. And one of the things I do say always is don't waste a day looking around at what you're lacking and what you don't have, because you right now are serving amongst some of the very, very, very best human beings you will ever be around in your life. And if you spend all your time focusing on the negative aspects of the system, the job, the career, the whatever, the bureaucracy, you're going to miss out on what you're experiencing, and you're only going to see it in the rearview mirror. I tell them I get teary eyed every time I come to the gate with my little green card, and they salute me coming to the gate. I get a little choked up. It's bizarre. And before, when I was like 6 months to go, that's when you're the most cynical of all. 6 months to go before I was about to get out, I was like, I hate every part about this. This is the worst. Everything made me mad. And again, old self to young self, man, you don't want to miss out on today's joy because you're focusing on that other stuff.
I think that's amazing advice for anybody listening, and it really is true. And I think part of it is subconsciously in that last 6 months, we're just like, you just need to point out all the bad
Yeah,
things so
that's
that
right.
it makes
Yeah.
it makes it seem like the breakup is easier.
Breakout. It's
Yeah.
silly that. It's silly that. Like,
Yeah, you're like,
oh, I
wow,
hate that she
they
chews her
suck.
food that loudly.
Yeah.
You know?
Takes so long to get on base. Ugh.
Yeah.
I always hate like
Yeah. Yeah.
whatever the thing is. Um, but I think if people were realistic with themselves, they would say, "Oh, there's good things. There's like serious benefits here." And I think that recognizing that is very important.
Yeah. Yeah.
So for you, you're talking about, so for this, how many years was it between when you got out and COVID?
Oh boy. I got out in 2008 and COVID was 2020. So 12 years.
Okay. So 12 years, you're trying to stay very busy. You're doing all this stuff in terms of fitness, putting things in the box. Um,
Yep.
what happens for you if you want to describe like what was COVID like and why was that transformative for you
Yeah.
in terms of being able to, because I met you post COVID, and I would describe you as a very insightful and collected individual. Um, so clearly something happened between COVID and when we first met. So what was that crucible like for you as you described it?
Yeah. So a couple, I think there's a couple context pieces that are important. So in 2017, I ended up promoting into a job which is largely like 90% administrative. Best equivalent would be like I don't know. I run a couple hospitals in a couple counties, and so I don't know whether it'd be like, I don't know. like it'd be a '06 or '07 or, level job, something like that in the military. And so largely, command, big budget, 3,500 people in my chain, all of that stuff. Right. And, I was still a physician. So as in our organization, you're still a physician, at least a little part of the time. So even for a job like mine, where it's mostly administrative, and it's not unlike the Air Force, like where, people who are, generals who are pilots get to go fly the airplanes every once in a while. They let them behind. They don't let them go do the actual wartime fighting, but they let them go fly around. And so I'm kind of that version of the doctor. I feel like I always tell people, like, I feel like they're always going to look over my shoulder, but mostly command. Um, and, I did it again. I was one of those reluctant leaders, but I had this sort of idea that, like, at the lower level, being what I was, a clinic chief, if I could help create culture and move change and all that stuff, well, boy, at this high level, how cool would that be? And how can we impact communities and all these things? Um, and I never could have foreseen, 2020, January 2020, I got a phone call at night that airplanes were coming in to Travis Air Force Base. Um, I don't think it's not secure anymore. I don't think, at least, but, from Wuhan, China, with State Department workers, some of whom were infected with this virus. Um, and at that time we didn't know anything about it other than China didn't look good at the time. Like, other than, like, they were, like, wealthy people's doors shut on their homes there. And,
I mean, it was
and so,
scary. Like, no one knew what I felt like in January. I felt like I was just sitting on my porch waiting for this, like, tidal wave to come through and just, like, blow away everything. And you couldn't see it. You didn't know when it was coming, but it was coming. And,
yeah.
like, it was suspenseful.
Yeah. So those were the very, very first COVID patients in the US coming in, that were actually being actively brought in. Now, there were probably some that had come through airports and stuff like that we didn't know about, but these were the very first. And it was the Travis, and there were some other, West Coast bases where they were coming in. And, so I was called, as the leader of one of the hospital systems to say, okay, they're going to be housed at the base, but they're not getting their medical care through the DoD, any of that stuff, because the DoD has to have operational readiness, right? Like, that's not the DoD's main mission. And these were, civilians, right? And my life really changed at that point. It was super interesting, because we had to think about, okay, what does it look like to take these folks, how do we transport them from the base to our hospitals? How do we, and we have protocols, right? We had protocols for Ebola and stuff like that never really came. But what does that all really look like? And it was the first time I had to ask people, my team, my physicians and my teams, potentially put themselves in harm's way, in a very real way, because people just didn't know, like, they didn't know the risk, right? There was all this fear. And, it was everything from that to calls with the CDC at the time, and because the CDC was here and they're with no sort of developed plan yet around COVID, because it was brand new. And, trying to think through, like, okay, what does this mean? How do we do this? And then when the first community case came up, okay, how do we protect our people? What does that mean? Like, we didn't know anything. And this is entering sort of January, February, March, when, there were national public health leaders saying, no, don't wear masks. Masks are not indicated. Don't do that. And, trying to mitigate all of that while we, looked at potentially running out of supplies, gowns, masks, all of it, like, running out, as the numbers started to pick up. And, every night I would literally go to sleep pretty much thinking, at some point, I'm going to be going to the funerals of my physicians and my nurses who are taking care of these patients, because there's going to be broad infection, right? Like, my colleagues are going to die. And I'd never in the military, like, I'd never been in a, command structure operational command structure where I was having to make decisions around how do we keep people safe? And then how do we take care of these patients at the same time? Like, how do we do both those things with limited supplies, limited information, all that stuff? And yeah, it was all encompassing. It's like everything we thought about all the time. And it was, I mean, I barely slept, maybe 4 hours a night. Um, and again, deployments the military is really smart, right? When you go to a hot zone, right, you go for a certain amount of time and they pull you out. Even like SEAL teams and stuff like that, right? Or your frontline infantry folks, you don't spend much more than typically 3 or 4 months doing active combat, and then they pull you out, they pull you back into, you got to go to LUD, get some R&R.
You can't spend that much time switched on like that.
Yeah,
It's too much.
But we didn't have that option, because the world went sideways, right? Everything got shut down. We didn't get shut down. As you know, sort of, there were these sort of like false waves of COVID that came. And, yeah. And then that same year, the incident with George Floyd happened, and that threw, my medical center and our people into, all that disarray spilled, both internally with our people. And then COVID got worse. And I just kept pushing. And by the end of 2020, and again, I was of the belief that I had enough energy, enough brains, enough everything. Like, I didn't need to sleep. I could just stay up. I could do it. I could push. I could be present enough. I was gowning up, and the first doctor that became symptomatic that we thought might have it was like 6 o'clock at night. And we didn't have a protocol for like, how do we test our people yet? And so I gowned up, put all the stuff on, it was the old days when like we were like doing all this handoff stuff, very, very careful. And went in the room with this poor, scared to death doctor and swabbed him, and stuff that's very routine now. But at the time, it was not. And I'm not saying that to actually make myself look heroic. I think it sort of points out the pathology I had of thinking I could be Superman.
And also that like you weren't willing to sacrifice anyone else for this thing.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. I mean, it was very much sort of like the classic, heroic military story of like, the guy that runs into, your Medal of Honor winners they're just, the highest example of, human beings ever. But this sort of idea that, in military culture, we do, right? That's what we do. And I think what I didn't realize at the time was, one, the box is full of stuff already. By the end of 2020, and I'd experienced some mental health blips before, like where I had some dissociation from my emotions and stuff like that, where I just become dead, dead above here. But by the end of 2020, I was not okay. I was not sleeping. I was eating, I was pretty much on a steady diet of like ice cream at home at night. I was more short. I was a lot more command and control. And then I was less empathetic with my troops, with my teams. I'm calling them troops, but like my teams who were getting sort of more and more burnt out and more angry. Cause they were starting to treat each other bad and treat people in my command structure badly. And I saw around me, my teams just killing themselves, trying to support the people doing the work. And, I essentially had this, this sort of breaking point moment. I remember really distinctly. I was meeting with a large group of physicians. And this was online. We had already gone to Teams and stuff for a lot of our meetings, Zoom, whatever. And I kind of lost it. Was like, cause they were really rough, really rough on me. And it was a group that I'd spent the entire year trying to protect, equip, arm, all that stuff. And I kind of just lost my professional demeanor. And first I got really angry, and I didn't curse or anything like that, but I was just really like, shut up and stop whining kind of thing. And then I got emotional and got teary, and I was like, whoa. And there's nothing wrong with that necessarily. I think vulnerability, in appropriate circumstances is fine. But I had realized I'd sort of cracked in half. So the next day I ended up calling our EAP is what we call it in the civilian sector. Essentially, it's the company psychologist that we have on staff. Law enforcement has it, we have it, and said, "Hey, I gotta see you and get some help." And so went in and kind of started a journey around. First time I'd really seen it there. I'd actually seen her 1 year before. I'd witnessed a 17-year-old girl got killed on the freeway. I was the first responder there for about 15 minutes with her and her boyfriend, because it was in the middle of the county, unincorporated, and was taking care of them. And she looked like my daughter. So I'd seen that woman a year before because I was having flashbacks around that. She saw me one time. I'm like, okay, good. I'm good. Back in the box. I'm fine. But I went back and saw her. And she specialized in trauma therapy. So there's something called EMDR, which is a therapy that was developed actually with veterans for PTSD. And she started taking me through some of that work. And what I found was, while COVID had cracked me open, the box was quite full with stuff that I had just not really dealt with before. And it began for me with what was, it ended up being a kind of a stuttering, multi-year journey on getting help around, why I was built the way I was built in regard to, the things that drove me into the career fields and the things that I did, how I grew up, all of that stuff. And in doing this trauma-based therapy, which was super helpful because it's not lay on the couch and cry and talk about your feelings, which I wanted no part of. I think like a lot of veterans, I'm like, that's what you're talking about? You go the other way.
Yeah, I mean, we're lean forward people, and we require action, and action, a path, orders, action. Like those are the things that we thrive in. And sitting on the couch and divining feelings from the ether is very not structured, and it's not who we are. So I completely get that.
It feels out of control.
Yeah.
That's the other, I think, the key piece. Like you're all of a sudden you're out of control, and I don't want to be out of control.
No.
But I was really lucky, blessed to have this therapist who was versed in some of this stuff that was where I didn't have to do, experience sort of go back to the dark spaces fully. She ended up referring me to someone outside who did something called brain spotting, which is a sort of a focused version of that same EMDR therapy. And I didn't go a ton. But again, I kind of went in smatterings. I'm one of those people, and I think like a lot of vets, the minute I felt good, I was like, okay, I'm good. I'm out. I'm good. Going back. And then what I'd found though is like, once the stuff had started to surface, I was figuring out more and more. I actually understood when I was like, oh, this is like palpitations, stomach pain, and all this stuff that I wasn't feeling before. So I ended up going back, and the journey took me through. Yeah, I'd say I'm still on it, but through going and kind of processing through and understanding exactly how I face and deal with really hard, harrowing situations and things like that. The good news from it, and the reason I'm telling you the story, is that I went into it. I didn't ever want to go to therapy or do any of those things because one, it was stigmatized, right? And two, I felt like I could ride my bike hard enough. I could, work hard enough. I could just do enough stuff to I was happy. Yeah, I was happy. And on the outside, you'd say I was happy, and I thought I was happy too. But I was actually pretty emotionally dead. And as I look back, the military connections were pretty unique for me because they were forged out of shared hardship. But part of the reason I couldn't really make connections outside of the military was because of the box. And so I didn't do well, making real connections with people. I could be your boss, I could be your colleague, but I didn't really have deep friendships, for the most part. And so I didn't want to go into therapy though, because I thought, who will I be? What will my identity be as a physician, as a veteran, as a leader, as someone who wants to dive in and jump on the grenade? I don't want those things to go away. That's who I am. That's who I am. I don't want to go to therapy and cry a bunch and then come out as some person that wants to, go home at 3 and plant a garden. So there was this huge fear for me. I'd lose myself, lose my identity, and so don't get help, because if I get help, the fixed version of me won't be able to go fight dragons. Right.
Yeah. And I think that's a very real fear for a lot of people, because there's this thought process that therapy means replacing or
Yeah.
leaving this military identity that we all value
Yep.
behind.
Yep.
And I as someone who's had to go through to therapy as well, um, I agree with what you're saying, and it's very much so like you don't leave it behind. You just get to figure out how to hold it in reverence without having it bog you down. Like the bad parts don't bog you down, but you can still have reverence for the things that make you who you are today.
Yeah. I'm
Um,
better. I'm a better
yeah,
version. That's sort of the punchline
yeah,
is like, now that I can actually feel most of my emotions, I'm much less likely to actually get to 10 out of 10 because I can actually feel when I'm at 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 and figure, oh, hey, what's going on? This person's really pissing me off in this conversation. Like I'm instead of just like, putting in the
yeah.
box and then I get to 10 and I'm out. I'm more connected with my family. I'm a better version of those things. And I'm not less brave.
No,
I'm a little less reckless than I was before, a little bit less reckless. My mountain biking history recently. And so I'm not completely less reckless, but a little bit less reckless. Yeah. So I only say that as for the folks who feel like they're destined to feel the way they feel because they've always felt that way, or that they'll lose some part of themselves. That's just not accurate.
no. I think that that's such an amazing thing to bring up. And you talk about identity, and I mean, the crux of this podcast is really talking about who we are post-military. Like
Yeah.
that's the important thing, because there are things in your military career that are valuable, that make you an amazing family member, friend,
Yeah.
worker, citizen, and those will always be with you. But there are things that you have to kind of move on from or build past, and doing that does not mean you will lose who you were.
Yep.
But you are something different now, and that has to be addressed. And I think that your story is just so powerful because it's a great example of someone who has been able to work through that.
Yeah.
So for someone, you kind of already talked about it, but for someone who is on the back, old you talking to young you,
Yeah.
what advice might you give yourself so that this process could have happened sooner? Do you think it could have happened? Like what, when it comes to rebuilding identity, what would you say to someone who's on the front end of this problem?
Yeah. That's a good question. Yeah, it's hard. It's a hard thing because I kind of like what I see practically, is, you'll continue to bash yourself against the rocks, until you finally, sink the boat, right? Like that's just like the nature of what we do. And it's hard for me to see if I would have listened to me, when I was, cause it was working out for me at that point. Right. Like I thought it was at least. And I don't think I had an openness to it as much, back. It was a point of pride, to be honest. Like the idea that like you could go and like, you know, code somebody, who's dying and bleeding and like, it's horrible. And then literally, 20 minutes, and talk to their family about it. And then 20 minutes later, go down and have a sandwich and laugh with friends in the cafeteria. For us, that was like, yeah, that's how we roll. Like that's what we do. And so I'm not sure I would have been totally open to it because I think it took me experiencing, like completely losing myself. I mean, getting to really dark places that I never thought I would ever visit my own brain.
Mhm.
To the point of like going, well, I just don't, the world would be better off without me. And I never got to that place where I acted on that. But I definitely felt that way. And so I think that's the lesson I would try to, teach. It's, the reason I got help, Billy, the first time when I saw that girl in that accident, the only reason I knew to go get help, is, through my work here, I meet with law enforcement and first responders. because law enforcement, the first responder community, and the military have actually done a much better job with mental health first aid and PTSD and all that stuff than the medical community has. And so I wanted to try to make like emergency medicine and some of our frontline care places more burnout proof and more trauma proof for people. Ironically, that's what I wanted to do for them, even though, because I didn't recognize like I had the same, disease. But so I met with a police officer who was doing some work in that space. And he disclosed to me how his dad was killed when he was 10. His dad was a police officer, was shot and killed when he was 10. And he went off the rails as a teenager, bad teenager, and then somebody had a crucial conversation with him. Like maybe it was a judge or somebody else that said, you better get it straight or you're going to prison. And he ended up doing what people do, which is he went into a helping profession as a cop himself. And never really dealt with all the stuff with his dad and all that. And ended up in I think it was his late 20s or early 30s as, full blown alcoholic, horrible home life, and just everything going off the rails. And so he ended up going in and getting help in this regard with this modality, this EMDR therapy, and then ended up founding a nonprofit group that takes officers on these 1 week retreats where they go in with a bunch of therapists who are specialized in this. They go in a cabin, 5 or 6 cops who are in big trouble in regard to their lives, and take them through intensive EMDR for a week. And then they come out and they've got a landing spot actually with, for this, it's like AA type communities, but they're completely formed of officers essentially. And so your AA community is officers who are addicted, and all that stuff. And so I met with him and he was telling me about this. I'm like, that is fascinating. That's so cool. Little, not even knowing that at some point my brain was going to crack open and I didn't have insight. But I tell him to this day when I see him that he saved my life. Because if I had not saw someone like who was like, he's a badass, like, big cop badge, works in a really rough community around here. Like he was the real deal. And had he not disclosed the way he had sort of fallen down and gotten help and gotten back up, I don't think I would have gone and looked for it that way.
That's amazing. And thank goodness that he did.
Right.
I guess it's interesting that you say that too, because it's almost like, and I agree, like my breaking point was not nearly as intense as running a medical facility during COVID, but I had to hit this wall where I realized, oh my gosh, like there's something wrong with me and I need to make these changes. And it's scary because it's almost like you're saying someone needs to basically bottom out before they can start ascending up. And it's scary because it's like you bottom out and then there's extreme options that exist in that dark space. And so what do you think that what are things that people could do or put in place so that when they bottom out, they're able to rebound versus regress or fall further?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I'll go back to the veteran piece because I think this is really important. I think if you recognize the fact that, the selection bias you have for joining the military, especially if you've joined a career field that is, high risk, high intensity, all of that stuff. Right. But I think you just have to sort of recognize like the stuff that there's stuff in there potentially. Right. I think sort of knowing the risk is there is the first piece. Right. I think surrounding yourself with people who you trust and respect and have your back is really important too. And I actually think the biggest thing we can do, the we's that are, kind of on, and I'll not say the other side, but I think, out of the pit for sure is talking about it and then recognizing it in others. Like the thing I took from the military, I tell people all about when we were 1 year into COVID and after I'd started got some of my own help, I said to the organization, I said, we are going to have a sea of people dealing with severe PTSD coming out of this. And we're not going to see it until the storm ends, because I knew what it looked like when people came home, my own friends from Iraq and Afghanistan, and they were okay there. I mean, they were okay. They were functioning there. And, it wasn't the music stopped that things were bad. And what I got from my military experience, though, is I can look at people and I can see when they've got that 1,000-yard stare, or I can recognize some of the behaviors and stuff. And I think that's where we can help each other as a community of vets. So, like, not only just this sort of informational thing you're doing with, like, how do you transition practically? How do you do it? How do you look for a job? What's the unique experience? What's the identity change? But I think looking out for each other like we always have,
Yeah.
Around that. I think that's the key. And maybe people don't have to get to the bottom then.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I think that we have a lot of resources on how to find a job out of the military. And I I think that the silent killer is going to be the separation of self. And it's the how do you, because it's dealing with identity is really hard. And that is not it's not profitable to talk about it. And it's scary because you have to admit that you are not put together in the way that you would like to be. And that's hard because in the military, that means that you are almost incapable of completing the mission, or you're going to let people down because you're not completely like buttoned up. And that's bad. And so building this awareness and building this muscle memory of like self-evaluation, I think is very important for people, not just those who are already out, but those who are going to prepare for this transition as well.
Yeah.
Um,
Do you mind if I
yeah,
reframe the way you said that, though? Because I think
of
it's
course, please.
I think we're actually put together perfectly. I
Yeah.
think we are uniquely built and created to do what we do, in the warfighting mission, in
Hmm.
being heroic. And like you had said, like, so people can sleep at night. There've got to be people, who are 18 years old plus who are willing to leave the safety of their homes to go in places like Africa, Afghanistan, Iraq, or, other places. Right.
Hmm.
I think we're built and created that way. The part that because it's not all of us like who come out and like have these kind of fractured pieces. I think the part that's broke that we have to work on is how to shut that on and off in a way that's healthy so that you can fully feel when you need
Yeah.
to fully feel. I think that's the piece. Cause that part of it is like this whole, like what we did and how we did it is actually crucially important.
Hmm.
And I think we're actually created perfectly for that as warriors,
Hmm.
but warriors can be good fathers and husbands and wives and
Yes.
leaders and doctors and stuff.
I completely agree, and
Yeah.
I think thank you for restating my thoughts because the thing that I wanted to get across is we are this thing, and that thing makes us very special.
Yeah.
However, the self doubt that can creep in is because there are moments where we feel more vulnerable.
Yeah.
You might not want to share that vulnerability
Yeah.
because that you might view that as bringing down your brothers and sisters who are serving alongside of you, when in reality, everyone deals with that. And that is not a negative. It's
Right.
just an aspect of who you are. And like you said, I think very eloquently, we are built this way to be protectors, and that is good. It is beyond good.
Yep.
It's amazing.
Yep.
And so um I don't think it's something the things that come with that service are not things that people should be ashamed of. They're just the realities of putting yourself in these situations. And
Yeah.
that's okay.
Yeah.
So,
I and the on that point, I think part of our fractured thinking sometimes is we think of ourselves as like cannon fodder. Like that's just my lot in life. Like part of the deal is like I just sacrifice myself, like, pretty much martyrdom, and like I don't have a lot of value for my own life, but what I do value is at least having a purpose in it to help and serve others. And that that it's that thinking is broken.
Hmm.
Because you can have, huge value in, who you were created to be and who you are. Um, and you can still be very sacrificial in how you serve others and put yourself, second. You can do all of those things without having a lack of your own self-value and self-worth. I think that's important.
I completely agree. And it's definitely, and especially stepping out of the service and into the next chapter,
Yeah.
like you are an individual now, and you recognizing that individual self-worth is going to be incredibly important in moving into whatever that next chapter of your life is going to be. Um, One more thing that I do want to ask you
Yeah.
before we wrap up is I brought it up a little bit, just you're a multifaceted person as an individual once you leave the military.
Yeah.
And you also have brought up things like community, church,
Yeah.
filling these various aspects of your life post military. Um, what do you think? What would be your recommendation? Any additional recommendations to somebody who needs to do that? Um, because they're like we've talked about church and we've talked about fitness and we've talked about that community. But how would you? What advice would you give to someone who's trying to build that multifaceted life post military transition?
Yeah. That's a really good question. I mean, I think the thing you should seek most fiercely, um, just in life in general. I believe this is ubiquitous, but I think, especially for a veteran coming out, is to fiercely seek healthy community. And the reason God changed my life, turned me completely around from a very selfish, angry person into, someone that loves others well and serves better. And so for me, that was where I went to find community, because actually, it's funny, community found me, and I found there were these people that acted radically different than the rest of the world, where it wasn't like there's a piece of the military that has a very, that very service oriented piece, right? Of like people that had my back, except they didn't have my back because we were in the military together, because we were in the same unit or whatever, but they had my back because that's, how God drove them to be, is what I understand now. So I think finding community, and I'm without, talking about Jesus, can't I can't skirt around that. That's, to
Hmm.
me, that is the answer, to what ailed me, and definitely what ails the world. And if that's not your lane, and honestly for me, like that wasn't, I resisted that for a very, very long time. So I was in my early 30s. Um, you do need to find good, healthy community, like right away. And I say good, healthy. If you go and you find, like, if where you find your community is in bars, or and nothing wrong with bars, nothing wrong having the beer with some friends or anything like that. But if you find it in those spaces where it's unhealthy interactions, whether it's the negativity spiral or substance abuse, or even in really, really high risk behaviors, um, I think it sets you up for a little bit. I think finding some community that is more tight knit around what you have in the military and what I've experienced in church is really important, you know. And it doesn't have to be big. I think a lot of people think, oh, I have to go, a lot of us hate this, like the idea of like, I got to go be with some big group of people. Screw that. I'm not doing that. But I think, if you can have two or three good friends in your life and find community that way, and if you're lucky enough to have a husband or wife that wants to be with you, that's probably good enough. Especially if they're really good. But I think that's the number one thing.
Yeah, I completely agree. And the way that I describe healthy community to people is are the morals and the values of the community more, are they more cemented? Like they're non-transient because they're like, if you think about a nonprofit or a religion,
Yep.
there are things like service, and then there is morality. It's attached to very like religious beliefs that are a lot more concrete and will outlast you or translate from chapter of your life to chapter of your life, while there are other values that are very much so um immediate. They disappear very quickly, and those quick hits will never give you that same level of belonging, because the military is built upon values that are very long lasting and very concrete. And so try and find community that's based in similar values.
Mhm.
And you'll be going in a good spot for sure.
Yeah, I think the warning thing to look out for too is that within any community, whether it's going to the nonprofit space or volunteering or church community or, another faith community, it's those places also are wide open to people who want to go overdo it and go hardcore. Like, welcome. Yes. Come on in. You want to volunteer in every place and do it all and like put, essentially cannon fodder, right? Burn all of yourself to serve. Yes, we will let you do that. And I think there was for me a propensity towards doing that too, even when I first got into church, like I immediately was like, I'm going to teach Sunday school. I'm going to run a free clinic. I'm going to run the missions team. I'll do announcements on Sunday, like, because my value came from like how I could serve other people. Um, and in my maturity, what I think I've really come to appreciate is that, really good, true community. It's it's an easy burden. It's actually like there's a sense of ease. I joke it's like everybody ought to have a group of friends where they could show up unannounced to their house on a Saturday morning in their pajamas and just come in and sit down, and it wouldn't be weird. And it wouldn't be weird. And like you could just chat, and it's easy, no makeup, no hair if you're into that, and you can just talk about your stuff. And it's funny, after my experience in this job, I ended up within the church, starting a small group. And, for those who aren't in the church, small groups are like, like the mini version of how people get together in community in churches that are bigger. Right. But I ended up starting one with other leaders in the community who had very, very high level leadership jobs. So one was a group commander at the base, and there were others I won't even name sort of the titles and positions, but people very high visibility, very high stress roles, and their spouses. And so there are 8 of us in the group to begin with. And holy smokes, save me, because you could come and show up and really talk about the real stuff. The real stuff, like the thing with my physicians, where I kind of lost it. Show up and talk about that, connect with each other, pray for each other, and not have to have the sort of the veneer on of I'm the leader, I'm the officer, anyway. So I think super important to have community like that.
That's awesome. I completely agree. It's a thing that'll hold you together and certainly pick you up if you fall,
Yep.
which is going to be which will most likely happen for people who are moving
Yeah.
out. Obviously, the fall is more extreme for others, but building that community around yourself is going to be the greatest safety net that you can find for
Yeah.
saving yourself in those times of need. So, Chris, thank you so much for coming on. Before we close, any final thoughts that you want to share to the listeners out there?
No, I mean, I appreciate being able to talk, through these stories and share. I mean, I think the legacy we leave often isn't things that you are, going to have on wall plaques or trophies or anything like that. I mean, frankly, I look back, as you get through life, and especially a full military career, right? And then beyond, like, man, I got like drawer full of coins and, you know, all that stuff. But if you can see over this is my right shoulder here. That's a picture of David Grant Medical Center, Travis Air Force Base. And around that whole picture are signatures of people that when I was at the residency, residents and faculty that I worked with there. And it's a great reminder of the impact we have on others while we're there. while we're doing what we do and serving, and how that's actually the thing that matters the most. Um, and I think just for people to not lose sight of that, regardless of what their role is, like the impact you have on the people around you is you don't know what it is, until it's
Yeah.
behind you in the rearview mirror. And that, I think that's the parting words I'd have.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on, really burying yourself for everyone out there listening. I think it's these are the conversations that need to happen, and I'm incredibly grateful to you for not only taking the time but having the um, courage to come on and talk about this stuff.
Of
So
course.
so seriously, thank you so much for coming on, and for everyone out there, thank you so much for listening. And as we continue to push out these episodes, please share with the people that need to hear this message. And we would love to. I'd love to have you as a subscriber on the channel to keep following all this content. So, thanks so much, everybody. I hope you have a great day. Peace.